Good afternoon. It is noon, and it is Thursday, the third Thursday of March, and that means Bites and Bits of History here at Tyler History Center, sponsored in part by the John and Loretta Hines Foundation. And wow, what a turnout today. Thank you all for coming out. Anybody here that's their first time for Bites and Bits? Okay, you? Yeah? Good. Well, welcome. This is a monthly program we do, and it's been going on for, what, 11, 12 years?
11 years, yeah.
11 years? Okay, so if you keep coming, we're going to keep doing it. It's as simple as that. So, my name is Bill Lawson. I'm Executive Director of Mahoning Valley Historical Society, and on behalf of all of our members, board members, staff, volunteers, we're so happy to have you here today. And this is part of our series leading up to our 150th anniversary, which will be this coming September 10th. And this series will run through August in terms of looking at our community's history over the decades, and then we'll look at our most recent history and where we might be going right at the end of the program. Before we get started, I've got a couple of things to address to you, announcements. We have a new exhibit coming up here in the Youngstown Foundation Community History Gallery. That will be opening on March 28th, and it's going to be called Preserving Our Past and What's New at MVHS. And what we plan to do with this exhibit is we're going to show a lot of things that have come in within the last 5 years that haven't necessarily gone and been on exhibit yet on a regular basis, so you can see the interesting artifacts and images and documents that we have, and tell a little bit of the stories that they all tell. And so we're looking forward to that coming up on March 28th, which is next Friday, I believe, yes. Coming up here in the region, Ohio Local History Alliance. This is a statewide organization advocating for local history and historical organizations. They're having our Region 4 meeting on Saturday, April 5th, and that opens at 9 a.m. and it'll run from 9:30 till about 3, 4, yeah. And that'll take place at our other new site down on the other end of downtown at 250 East Federal Street, formerly known as the IBM building. We're trying to move away from that. But that'll be on a Saturday morning and afternoon, and if you're interested in learning more, please see Tracy Manning, our Curator of Education, who is also a board member of the Ohio Local History Alliance, and she can give you more information. We're very soon launching this year's series from the Mahoning Valley Cultural Alliance, and you have flyers on your tables about that. And this is the second year of the series themed Stories of Immigrants to the Mahoning Valley. And we begin on Monday, April 7th at 5 p.m. at Western Reserve United Methodist Church, and that's 4580 Canfield Road Route 62, heading out from Cornersburg to Canfield. And our first subject will be about Sweden and Swedish immigrants here in the Mahoning Valley. So if you're interested, please see Linda, who can get you signed up for that today if you'd like to attend on Monday, April 7th. Jumping ahead to next month, our program for Bites and Bits will be Thursday, April 17th, and it'll be called Testing Our Strength, the Mahoning Valley in the 1940s, and Tracy Manning will be our speaker on that day, looking at that pivotal decade, both here in the Mahoning Valley, but internationally, I'd say, in terms of what was going on and how we related to it. So, but before that, we are going to look at the decade of the 1930s, and our speaker today is Sean Posey. And Sean T. Posey is an historian and librarian. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including Echoes Magazine, publication of the Ohio History Connection, Bloomberg, City Lab, Salon, and Bill Moyers and Company. He is the author of 3 books, Lost Youngstown, The Historic Theaters of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, and Hidden History of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley. Currently, Sean is a librarian at the Austintown branch of the Public Library of Youngstown and Mahoning County, and I'm very pleased to present Sean to speak on Through the Dark Valley, Youngstown and Mahoning Valley, 1930 to 1939. Sean.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Justice. So, if you were here for last month's program, the 1920s, the so-called Roaring 20s, this is a very different decade, the 1930s. Certainly one of the most difficult decades locally and internationally during the 20th century. It begins in Depression and it ends in war, that is World War II with the German invasion of Poland. And if you're familiar with this history, because of our time constraints, I'm not going to do enough justice to some of the topics that I gloss over here today, but I wanted to try to give you as good a look as possible about what was going on the ground here, and of course, its connection to what was going on in the nation during the Great Depression. So, here's a great, not very often seen photograph that is in my last book, Hidden History of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley. This is the Spring Commons area during the Great Depression, and we are right here. If you needed some frame of reference there, I just wanted to throw that in because that's one of my favorite photographs of the area from this time period. So briefly, let's touch on the 1920s. In the summer of 1929, the United States goes into a recession. In October of 1929, we have Black Thursday, which leads to what became known as the Great Crash, the stock market crash of October 1929, which marked the end of the Great Hoover bull market. Of course, Herbert Hoover was elected the Republican in 1928, and there was a booming stock market that led up to after his inauguration until the summer, and it all came crashing down in October of 1929. It would eventually lead to what historians would call the Great Depression. Now, going all the way back until the 19th century, there had been a lot of economic recessions in the United States, devastating recessions. Often they were called panics. The original Great Depression was actually an event that happened after the Panic of 1873, and for the next 20 years there was a lot of economic turmoil in the United States. Sometimes historians call that period the Long Depression. However, the Great Depression of the 1870s, of course, would be superseded by what happened in the 1930s, and this era would be forever known as the Great Depression. Hopefully, we won't have anything else that will supersede that. So let's talk about the downturn in the early part of the Depression. In 1929, unemployment in the agricultural sector was 1.5 million or 3.2%. In 1930, unemployment in the same sector was 4 million or 8.7%. So the downturn is starting to gather steam going into 1930. This is months after the initial stock market crash. Of course, the president at the time I mentioned is Herbert Hoover. Here's a great picture of a crowd at a campaign rally that Hoover held in Youngstown in 1928. This is at the B&O. You can see the Youngstown sign in there. You can see Hoover's campaign sign in the background. Hoover was an interesting character. He didn't believe in large-scale government involvement in the economy or with helping the unemployed, which was actually nothing special. This was the accepted belief system at the time. Hoover was a conservative. He very much believed in self-reliance, and he thought that if the government kept its hands off the economy as much as possible, that things would bounce back eventually. Though as the downturn got worse, he did things like establish the Presidential Emergency Committee for Employment, which helped coordinate voluntary efforts between charities, volunteers, and private businesses. Hoover encouraged companies to maintain staffing levels and wages despite the declining economy. And he also established something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which designed to do such things as recapitalize failing banks. Because as the 1930s start, there's a bank crisis spreading across the United States. And by 1931, 1932, the banks in places like Youngstown would actually begin to close, period, or not permit people to pull their money out of the banks as the crisis deepened. So the things that Hoover did try to do were not successful, and of course as time would go by, Hoover himself would be blamed for the Depression, rightfully or wrongfully. There's a great resource that we have here in the Valley. In 2009, a book was published called The Great Depression, A Diary. And it was a diary that was written in the 1930s and 1940s and a little bit later by Benjamin Roth, who was a local lawyer. And it was observations about the economy, the stock market, and what was going on in the Mahoning Valley. And it became a very big success. The New York Times reviewed it, and it's a great resource not only to get a first-person account of the Depression, but to actually hear about what was going on here locally. And I'm going to roll in a few quotes by Roth as we go through this that gives some idea of what's happening here on the ground. This one is from an entry that he made in his diary on August 18, 1931. Quote, "The town is fast becoming panic-stricken. Everyone is talking about the Depression and wondering when it will end." And from 2 days after that, August 20th, 1931, holdups and killings are becoming more common, and it's dangerous to walk the streets at night. So at the same time in 1931, right around May, as the crisis deepens, we start to see the first signs of political unrest. And here we had a very strong communist movement that began to come to the fore. And in May 1931, this is a picture, not a very good one, I'm afraid, from the Vindicator, of a march, actually an illegal march, that the local communists had through Central Square after they were denied a parade permit by the Heffernan administration. When this happened, several hundred communists clashed with 100 police in Central Square and near Communist Party headquarters on East Federal Street, and a giant rolling fight went on from there. A lot of people were hospitalized, including a couple of police officers who almost died. When the Vindicator reported on it, they said members of the crowd who fought the police wielded, quote, paving blocks, pistols, tear gas, bombs, and knives. Clashes were reported as far away as Hillman Street and at Council Rock on the east side of Youngstown. And this event would, in similar fashion, play itself out again a year later, though less violently. But this was a sign of the great consternation that was going on the streets of Youngstown and in Warren as the economy is collapsing and more people are out of work, wandering around, homeless, looking for food. Now, interestingly enough, I call this section Splendor Amidst the Sorrow. Right about 2 weeks after the Red Riot on Central Square, the wealthy and the important in the Youngstown area gathered to celebrate the opening of the Warner Theater, which of course is today Powers Auditorium. What I think is interesting about this is 1931, and the opening of the Warner Theater, to me, kind of symbolizes the cap on and the end of the great Youngstown building boom of the 1920s. So I'm sure if you were here last month, you heard about it. It's when the modern skyline of Youngstown gets filled out during the Roaring '20s. And really, the kind of end of it here is the building of the Warner Theater, which kind of symbolizes Youngstown at its height. There's 170,000 people that live in Youngstown at this point, and it's one of the great manufacturing centers of the country, and at least before the Depression, manufacturing workers in Youngstown earned some of the highest wages in the industry, but as you'll see a little bit later, compared to modern wages, they were not all that great. So what's interesting, a few things interesting about the building of the Warner Theater, when they began to put in the foundation, what used to be on the location was a place called the Cornfield Club, which was basically a speakeasy or a place where they produced illegal liquor. There's a great article in the Vindicator. The workmen who were building the theater found a giant cistern underground, and much to their consternation, instead of being filled with booze, it was filled with water. But that was a sign of what was going on in Youngstown in the 1920s. And what was interesting was, right next door, the Warner Brothers company actually originally planned to build a 20-story hotel, which would have been the tallest structure in downtown, and it never came to fruition. And I imagine if there's any one reason we can pick out for that, it was probably the Great Depression itself. The Warner Theater was actually announced way back in 1925. It was designed by the famed Rap and Rap company that designed a lot of theaters in the United States, including the Oriental and Palace theaters in Chicago and the famed Paramount Theater in Times Square. When it was finished, the Warner Theater was built for $1.5 million, or adjusted for inflation, $30 million today. So, and this also was really kind of symbolized the height of theater building, back at a time when theaters were big, they were ornate, they were beautiful, at least downtown theaters. And this would be the last of its kind that we would see here in the Valley, and maybe perhaps fittingly, it's the last of the old theaters downtown that is still standing in any way, shape, or form. It had 113 rooms that were built into it, including showers and changing rooms for the ushers. Even the projectionists had their own lavatory and shower. And on the night that it opened, they had Klieg lights downtown. The heads of the local steel companies were there. It was a very glamorous event. Mayor Heffernan at the time was there in his swallowtail tuxedo, and he spoke to the crowd, and perhaps acknowledging the depression out there on the streets, he said, quote, "Let us forget our troubles and move forward toward a glorious future, heart to heart and shoulder to shoulder." And the Vindicator had a lot of great coverage of that night. Here's a wonderful quote that I pulled out of that coverage that gives you some idea of maybe what that night was like. This is a Vindicator reporter. "You'd never have believed, had you been a Buck Rogers returning from a trip to Mars, that Mother Earth was in pains of depression. The gowns in which feminine beauty whisked to the new Warner would indicate they had the treasuries of kingdoms at their commands." Certainly don't read prose like that in any newspaper nowadays, do you? But it must have been, if you were one of the men that were waiting in a soup line outside, it must have been a hell of a contrast which was going on the streets of downtown and what was going on in the Warner Theater that night. And to give you the complete flip side of that coin, I'm going to talk about a couple of the places that emerged to deal with the burgeoning problem of homelessness in Youngstown during that time, to give you a very gritty view of what life was like for a lot of people. So this dilapidated building, this is a picture I took, is out on Blaine Avenue on Youngstown on the east side of what used to be called the Hazleton area. This was originally a police precinct, and during the 1930s it became a, quote, flop house. You using the parlance of the time, for homeless men in the city and hobos that were coming through town on the rails. And the city called it, in a kind of, I don't know, ghoulish sense of humor maybe, the Friendly Inn. It accommodated anywhere from 100 to 200 men a night. Imagine 200 men packed into this little building. In the early 1930s, it was there from about 1930 to when the city closed it down in 1934. The city ran it. By July of 1931, approximately 3,000 guests, as they called them, were coming through a month. So these were local guys who were laid off out of the steel industry, didn't have any work or food, and these were also people who were coming through, hobos as they called them, riding the rails, who needed to stop someplace and get a meal to eat. So they got one meal a day, and the food were leftovers provided by grocery stores and restaurants. And the place even had volunteer nurses to deal with a lot of the men who came through who were very sick, probably from exposure to the elements. The Vindicator did a really good job of covering what was going on in this place. One interesting story I pulled out, in March 1931, local union barbers volunteered to shave and cut the hair of the men at the Friendly Inn. One man who was passing through the city declared, quote, "I shall never forget Youngstown. At age 75, he was the oldest of the men at the inn." The Vindicator described the place in this way, in this article, a little quote I pulled out, quote, "In one respect, the Friendly Inn is no different from any flop house in that it is very crowded. At every bend in the stairway, at every corner in the hallway, at the old Blaine Avenue police station, a man curls up at night with less to be thankful for than many a dog that sleeps on a rug before a fireplace." So that's a really interesting, powerful quote that gives you some idea about what life was like in a place like this during the Depression. So the city was always on the verge of closing it down. They feared that some sort of epidemic of disease might break out of the place. So after a while, they opened another flop house, and this is actually what the city referred to it as, a flop house, inside of a soup kitchen at the corner of Watt and Wood Streets. Now, there were other things that were going on in the Hazleton area. Some of you may have heard of at least the old settlement houses that the city used to have. If you're familiar with the settlement house movement, probably at least some of you have heard of Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago. Settlement houses did a lot of different things, but during the Depression, the Hazleton Settlement House distributed food to 125 families in that area and served daily breakfast for school children. They conveyed messages to people without phones, and they provided rides to doctors and hospitals for people that didn't have reliable transportation. You could even take a bath at the settlement house. This is probably due to the fact that you had people who were out on the streets, or people who simply didn't have running water in wherever it was they were living during this time period. So that's another example of the great need for volunteer agencies and for donations that people had to put together to deal with the fact that the government wasn't doing much and the crisis was just deepening as 1931 turned into 1932. Some more facts about the Friendly Inn. 41,700, mostly men, passed through there in 1931. 86% of them that the city counted were men, so there were some women. Men died at the inn too, often from afflictions related to exposure, such as pneumonia. The counterpart to that was an even larger place located out near the city's garbage incinerator on Poland Avenue called Hoover City. Probably most of you have heard of the large informal homeless settlements that sprang up across the United States during the Depression, which were always referred to as Hoovervilles. Of course, that was after Herbert Hoover, the president, who was widely blamed for the Depression. There was even a giant Hooverville inside of Central Park in New York City. Ours was a place called Hoover City, as I mentioned, located off by Poland Avenue. The city referred to as a packing box settlement, gathered around the city garbage incinerator. Two reasons: A, there was food that could be scrounged at the garbage incinerator, and it also produced heat during the winter, though one can only imagine what the smell that it might have produced as well. The city tolerated it for a while. They did a census every year of Hoover City. And each packing box or structure that the men lived in actually had a number, as in Hoover City number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. It had hundreds of residents during the coldest months of the year. The Vindicator once again covered Hoover City pretty well. Here's a quote from a man that it interviewed, asking him about the Depression in 1931. He said, "It hits us first and leaves us last." Hoover City, by the way, was built, quote unquote, in 1930. The man said, "Every day I go down to search for work downtown and never find any. I get as much food from homes as I can." It was common for hobos and homeless men riding the rails to actually go to people's back porches and knocks on houses and actually ask for whatever food anyone could spare. "I get as much food from homes as I can, and I often go to the incinerator and search there for a piece of bread, meat, or anything else that I can eat." And usually about once a year, families would gather together and go to the incinerator and dig through it to see if they could find anything that could be salvaged for use or that could be resold. So these were very, very desperate times. And as Sherry Lincoln and John Russo, the authors of Steeltown, USA, point out, Youngstown was one of the hardest hit cities in the United States, probably due to the fact that we were relying on the steel industry, and the steel industry all but collapses during the early 1930s. We also have a good description of Hoover City from a Marxist communist publication called The Militant. I mentioned the Bolshevik Reds earlier. There was a lot of coverage of Youngstown in communist and socialist newspapers during the time. And a magazine called The Militant sent a reporter out to Youngstown in 1932 to interview men at Hoover City. And this is what that reporter said. He described the area as about 5 or 6 acres behind the garbage incinerator, made of, quote, shacks, huts, or shelters hastily constructed from radio containers, boxes, crates, some just large enough for a man to crawl into out of the weather, some buried in holes in the ground, on property that has for years been the dumping ground of filth and now is the home of several hundred men who, having spent the best years of their lives in the steel mills and coal mines of Ohio and Pennsylvania, are now literally thrown on the garbage heap. Restaurant cast-offs make the choicest morsels for the men. The alternative is the notorious soup line. The men seem to prefer the mull over garbage than to expose themselves to the miserable soup. It is almost impossible to beg for food in Youngstown because of the large numbers of the hungry. The reporter for The Militant described most of the men living there as actually working class men who had worked in the steel industry or the railroad industry and the coal mines. And the city government actually confirmed that when they did their census. They said most of the men had been longtime residents of Youngstown, and right before the crash had been working often in skilled professions in the local industries, and now they had been rendered destitute. The city didn't mind most of the men living there, but they were always very weary of what they called floaters, men who came in from out of town riding the rails and who stayed in the area for a while. And there was probably good reason for that, for men were also murdered in Hoover City. There were murders that took place there. And a number of years later, during the Depression still, the infamous torso murderer, a serial killer who had been active in Cleveland at the time. A lot of people think that he was a hobo riding the rails and killing people, also murdering men and women in the Hoovervilles of Cleveland, that he was active in this area as well, and that he killed some men on a rail car that came in through Youngstown and Struthers. So it's even possible that the torso murderer, who Elliot Ness, by the way, if you remember Elliot Ness, when he was working in Cleveland, he tried to catch the torso murderer, was unsuccessful. The torso murderer may have even stayed at Hoover City at one time or another, just to give you an even darker view of things that were going on there. In 1933, the city said that they were going to go in and tear down the settlement, quote, around the men's ears. They were finally done with tolerating it. The men at Hoover City said, okay, we'll go ahead and go, but you're not taking our homes. So they set fire to all the boxes and the structures there and burned the place to the ground. Several years after that, the city reported that men were trying to come back to the incinerator and were digging holes in the ground where they could live, and the city had to send the police force in to throw them out. So this gives you another idea exactly of how desperate circumstances were for a lot of people going into the year 1932, when, by the way, unemployment, official unemployment in the Great Depression reached its peak of 25%. And it's probable that unemployment in Youngstown was even higher than that. And that was only official unemployment. For men that were still working in the steel industry was just barely plugging along. If you were lucky enough to have a job, you didn't work part-time, full-time, you worked part-time. And a lot of the time you were paid in food or maybe even in coal. So circumstances were not good for even men that had jobs. There had been trouble in Hoover City as well. In May of 1932, 1,000 communists raised the red flag over Central Square and then marched to Hoover City. These are reasons probably why the city tore the settlement down. Right around 1932, there were national hunger marches that were organizing all across the country, where homeless and hungry men were getting together to march on Washington, asking for the government to do something. Of course, this was also the time of the Bonus March, when men who had been veterans of World War I converged on Washington to demand their bonuses. The bonuses, I don't think, were supposed to be paid until the 1940s. And the Hoover administration actually sicked the army on these men and drove them out of town. So this was a pretty bloody and dangerous time. Another quote from Benjamin Roth that I pulled out of his diary in 1932. He said, both Youngstown and Warren look lean and hungry. The streets are crowded with shabby, unemployed, vacant storerooms everywhere, signs on closed banks, bankruptcy sales and half-price sales in the stores that are open, soup kitchens. It will take long to forget these things. So in November 1932, not surprisingly, the Democratic candidate Franklin Roosevelt crushes Herbert Hoover and in 1933 assumes the presidency. When Roosevelt comes into office, the country is really in a slow motion collapse. The economy is falling apart. There's a banking crisis. And the brain trust that Roosevelt gathered put together a whole variety of programs which came to be known as the alphabet soup agencies. You've probably heard of some of them, like the CCC, the TVA, the NRA. TVA was the Tennessee Valley Authority, in an effort to deal with the Depression. And Roosevelt's idea, quite different than Hoover's, was that the government had to get involved in stabilizing the economy and putting people back to work, or things were going to get desperately out of hand. And of course, he must have been looking overseas to see what was going on. In the same month that he was inaugurated, Adolf Hitler, the Chancellor of Germany, would basically deconstruct German democracy and establish a fascist state to match that of Italy. And there was fears in the United States that something similar would happen here, or that there would be a communist revolution in line with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So the New Deal comes in and tries to deal with this crisis. And for the local area, one of the most important elements of it was the Works Progress Administration. This is a picture I took. Somebody may know better than me. I can't quite remember where I took this. I think this is a bridge on Shenley in Youngstown that was built by the WPA. Probably all of you at some time or another have seen the WPA cornerstone in some old building or on the trails at Mill Creek Park. At its height, about 1 in 8 Ohioans worked for the WPA. The WPA came out of the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act of 1935, and the idea was it was to build infrastructure in urban areas and put men to work. The government was involved. They provided the bulk of the funds. Localities that were involved with the WPA also had to kick in some money, and the idea was get men off the street and off the dole and out of the bread lines and put them to work doing things like building schools, building bridges, repaving roads. There's a whole wide variety of things that were done here. If you're interested more in that, in my last book, Hidden History of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, I have 2 chapters on the WPA in this area. That'll give you a much more detailed overview of what it was doing at the time. The largest WPA project was the building of the Youngstown Municipal Airport in 1940, on which 1,000 men were involved. And well into 1939, when the war starts in Europe, the WPA is still very important for Youngstown. In 1938, 12.39% of people working in Mahoning County are working for the WPA. It's over 16% in Trumbull County. The program started in 1935, and very quickly there was 4,000 men and 3,400 women working for the WPA. The kind of work that women did was different, obviously. Once again, I would encourage you to read my book, the chapter on that. I talk about some of the work that women did during the WPA. There were 7,800 workers for the WPA in Mahoning County still as late as 1939, and this was when the steel industry was starting to get back on its feet even. So this gives you some idea of what was going on with Roosevelt and the New Deal and the attempts to stabilize the economy after he comes into office. Here's a picture of the building of the Youngstown Municipal Airport in 1940, the biggest WPA project. So in 1935, the Wagner Act is passed, or the National Labor Relations Act. This has a lot of importance for this area. To sum it up very briefly, it created the National Labor Relations Board, and really for the first time in American history, in Section 7, it guaranteed the right for workers to legally organize themselves in unions. Prior to this, despite the fact that there were unions, union organizing was no guaranteed right. In fact, in a lot of places in the United States, court injunctions were used to break up strikes, and it was very common for local governments, state governments, and even the federal government at times to order in troops to smash strikes, often involving incredible levels of violence. So this is a huge event. This is a seminal event in American history, and it encourages a very large unionization efforts all across the United States in all different kinds of industries. So this is a big upsurge in labor organizing. Labor organizing had basically been dead in the 1920s in the aftermath of some failed strikes in the World War I era, including the Great Steel Strike of 1919, which this area had been very much a part of. This was part of what historians would end up calling the Second New Deal. To give you a brief overview of it, this was the Social Security Act of 1935, established unemployment insurance, pensions, and aids for the disabled. The WPA, as I mentioned, the Wagner Act, the Rural Electrification Administration, which brought electricity to rural areas, and the Fair Labor Standard Act, which set a minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, and restrictions on child labor. So this is a lot. This is the kind of apex of the New Deal, the so-called Second New Deal. So the labor issue. After the Wagner Act, events here start to move pretty quickly. The steel industry at the time is extraordinarily dangerous and not very profitable place to work. In 1924, this is 5 years before the recession, during the so-called boom times of the 1920s, the average wage for hourly workers in steel was the inflation-adjusted equivalent today of about $7 to $10 an hour. In 1928, there were 229 deaths and 1,000 permanent disabling injuries in the steel industry. So you can see why there's an effort to organize steel very quickly. The American Federation of Labor, which was a long-standing union, was rather conservative. In 1935, a breakaway group emerges out of the AFL called the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Today, the AFL and CIO are one organization, but they were separate from about 1935, I think, to 1955. One of the main goals, maybe the main goal of the CIO, is to organize the steel industry. This had been a long-sought goal of union efforts across the country, the idea being if you could unionize the steel industry, you could unionize any industry. This was the commanding heights of the American manufacturing economy. So you can see why when the CIO forms the SWOC, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, it immediately sends organizers to this area. One of the most prominent in this area, an organizer who would later become rather infamous, or maybe he was already infamous at the time, who helped organize, basically organized himself, Trumbull County, a guy by the name of Gus Hall, if any of you remember that name. Gus Hall was a really rough and tough guy. He had cut his teeth in one of the most famous strikes of the area, the Minneapolis Teamsters strike. He came here to organize the steel industry. He was a committed communist, And several times during the course of his life, he'd be a fugitive from justice, and he later became head of the Communist Party USA. He was here working for the SWAC, organizing the steel industry, and he would later be a big part of what became the Little Steel Strike. So in 1936, there's finally a strike, an effort to organize the so-called little steel companies. So amazingly enough for the CIO, the big effort was to organize United States Steel. US Steel was by far the largest of the steel companies, and to the surprise of the CIO, US Steel almost immediately agrees to recognize the SWAC and to unionize its mills. After that, they thought, well, it shouldn't be very hard to organize the so-called little steel companies, which were all of the steel companies that weren't US Steel. For our purposes, that's Republic Steel and Youngstown Sheet 2. Republic Steel was headed by a guy by the name of Tom Girdler, who was probably the most anti-union man on the face of the planet. And Republic Steel and Youngstown Sheet 2 refused to meet with the SWAC or to recognize the union. Instead, they began arming themselves. They began filling the local mills with weapons, tear gas, rifles, pistols, and the men who remained loyal to the steel company barricaded themselves inside the mills. And after a time, the companies realized, this was especially big in Trumbull County, that they needed to feed and supply these men. So they actually had their own little mini Air Force, and they would fly in supplies to the mills to keep the replacement workers, or the scabs, depending on what side of the situation you were in, to keep them fed and clothed during this time period. But it didn't take long for the Little Steel Strike to become very violent. On Memorial Day, 1937, in Chicago, company guards at Republic Steel and Chicago police officers fired on men, women, and children on the picket line, killed 10 people. Within a month, there would be a similar incident here in Youngstown, down on Poland Avenue, that became to be known as the Women's Day Massacre. Here's a picture, which may or may not have been from that day. It was a day where women came down to the picket line, and no one's entirely sure what happened. One story is that women were taunting Republic Steel guards and yelling obscenities at them. But in any case, company guards and snipers from the mills fired on the strikers, or the strikers fired on them, we don't know. 2 people were killed, and a number of people were injured in a big shootout that took place up and down Poland Avenue. It was pretty serious. Strikers overturned a bus, blocked the road. They were firing back and forth with company guards. It was a high level of violence. And after this, not very long after this, I'm going to skip over a few different things, when it became clear that there was a lot of other unions that were going to pour into Youngstown to back up the CIO, eventually the National Guard is sent in to shut down the city. And basically what the steel companies do is they just wait out the strikers, and the strike fails, and the efforts to organize the little steel companies are not successful. And they really won't be successful until World War II breaks out, and the government basically comes to the remaining companies and say, hey, if you want war labor contracts, you're going to recognize what becomes as the United Steelworkers. But that's not until about 1942. So as you can see, there's all kinds of trouble on the ground in Youngstown and Mahoning County, also in Trumbull County. In Trumbull County, Gus Hall, after the strike is over, has to go into hiding because he's wanted for a plot to dynamite the Republic Steel Mill over in Warren. So this was very, very serious business. This was nothing like strikes that we have today. But this is an example of the kind of latter part of the Great Depression here in Youngstown. But really, even going into 1939 and 1940, the Depression is still hanging on. Even though, as the war in Europe starts, after Hitler invades Poland, American defense industry starts to get on its feet, and as it does, more and more men go back to work. And then, after Pearl Harbor, of course, unemployment crashes down to about 1%, and almost everybody is either working or they're out fighting in Asia or over in Europe. That's really the end of the Great Depression. The Great Depression has its ups and downs. And one of the ups was by 1937, people thought maybe we were almost out of the Great Depression. And then we had the Roosevelt, so-called Roosevelt recession of 1937, May 1937 to June 1938. Unemployment shot back up to 20% in 1938. What happens is there's a lot of fear about the deficit. So Roosevelt pulls back on a lot of government spending, and when this happens, the economy starts to go back into a tailspin. The Social Security Act, which was passed in 1935, introduced payroll taxes, reducing workers' take-home pay and increasing labor costs for businesses. The Federal Reserve increased reserve requirements for banks, which reduced the amount of money banks could lend. So once again, the Depression, which had eased off a lot by 35, 36, goes right back to almost where it was in 1932 for about a year or so in 1938. So the Depression kind of goes up and down like this. It's a long, complicated event. So by 1940, I believe it was one last event, because this is a local and national history. All throughout the 1930s, of course, I've talked to you about people living on the street. There's a big housing crisis in Youngstown that's never quite resolved. There's a lot of people living in inadequate slum housing, and there's not enough housing exists, not even enough bad housing. So the city for a long time is plotting a slum clearance campaign. And in 1937, the U.S. Housing Act is passed. And probably due to the power of our local congressional representatives, Congressman Kerwin, Michael Kerwin, in conjunction with the U.S. Housing Act of 1937, the first public housing project in the United States that's authorized is the building of Westlake Terrace. Everybody remember Westlake Terrace? I believe it's now called the Village at Arlington Heights or something like that. It's located off of Martin Luther King, or was located off of Martin Luther King, which was then West Federal Street. This is a picture of the beginning of the slum clearance campaign. This area was centered around Westlake Crossing, where the railroad used to come through. It was notorious for its old and inadequate housing, slum housing. A lot of it would be torn down, and Westlake Terrace would be built. Westlake Terrace was 618 units capable of holding 2,500 families. When it opened, Congressman Kerwin said, quote, "The Youngstown project was not only the first in the country to be authorized, but I believe it will be the first to be completed. It serves as a model for other cities." And when it opened to families in 1940, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, came to cut the ribbon. And when she spoke, she said, quote, "What I have heard and seen here this afternoon speaks well for the future." So this is kind of the beginning of public housing in the United States, and it's taking place right here in Youngstown. And my family, my father's family, actually came from Pittsburgh to Youngstown specifically to try to get into Westlake Terrace. But they couldn't get in because my dad's father, who was a butcher, who was only working part-time at the time, actually made too much money to qualify. So my dad's family had to move out to Boardman, and for years my father said that his father was complaining that they had to live out in Boardman in the goddamn sticks, as he said. So that right there should give you some idea of the changes in Youngstown and Boardman between 1940 and now. Well, that, my friends, is a very, very brief overview of the Great Depression in our area during certainly the darkest decade in Valley history, at least until the mills began to close in the 70s and 80s. So I hope you got something out of that, and I hope that primes you to come back next month and hear about the Mahoning Valley during the 1940s and during World War II and the aftermath of the long-awaited aftermath of peace after 1945. Thank you very much for attention. I don't know if we have any time, if anybody wants to ask questions or comments, I'd be glad to take them. Yes, sir.
Me?
Yeah, yes, sir, yes.
Could you please remind me, my mind is a little soft, AFL-CIO, what it stands for?
American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So up until the 1930s, there was just the AFL. The CIO broke away. The CIO was a more radical union. There were a lot of communists in the CIO union. The CIO organized the United Auto Workers. That was their big first breakthrough in, I think, 1936, 1937 in Flint, Michigan. They organized the UAW. In the 1950s, they would merge back again. and become one organization, and now they're known as AFL-CIO. Yes, sir.
Isn't it true that when the Depression began, Herbert Hoover put on tariffs through the Hoover-Hartley Act?
It is, yeah.
That many economists believe those tariffs made the Great Depression a lot worse than what it would have been.
Yeah, you know, I took a lot of my reading from Ben Bernanke. Do you remember Ben Bernanke? He used to be the Fed chairman. He's kind of seen as an expert on the Great Depression, and I read his book. And what he said was, yeah, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was a bad idea. According to Bernanke, though, the real reason the Depression was so bad, in his eyes, was that the United States stayed on the gold standard for so long. Of course, the gold standard back then was the idea that if you had a currency, it had to be backed by gold. And you know, the amount of currency in circulation was tied to the amount of gold that you had in your reserves. And because of that, deflation was actually a chronic problem, not inflation. And according to Bernanke, as the Depression goes along, the major industrial countries start to get off of the gold standard. And we get off in 1933. But Bernanke says the countries that stayed on had much worse circumstances than the countries that got off the gold standard right away. I think England got off the gold standard very quickly, and their experience of the Depression was much less severe than, say, ours, or Germany's, or I can't think of, I don't know, France, how long they stayed on, but we stayed on for a while. And it's interesting to read Benjamin Roth's book, The Great Depression Diary, because almost everything he says is, he's a Republican, he's thinking in the mindset of the time. He was worried about the New Deal was going to create inflation. He was against most aspects of the New Deal, and he was very much for the gold standard. But according to Bernanke, everything that Roth wrote in his book was wrong. So, take of that what you will. Yes, ma'am.
You said that the one flop house that you highlighted there serviced about 100 men an evening.
Or even 200. And the building is still there. You can go see it. See how small it is.
So where did women and children go?
Women and children, most of the people that were on the streets were men. Yeah, single men often. Well, and men who sometimes just left their families. There were also men that killed themselves too. There were stories of people jumping off the bridge over at Spring Common. You know, women, it's not like there weren't women that were homeless. If you especially look at like The Grapes of Wrath, you know, even that's a fictional account of the Dust Bowl Okies that were going out west, a lot of those people were families, and they were living out of their cars or living in the woods and things like that. But here, from at least, we're talking about Hoover City or you know, the flop houses that I could read about, it seems like almost everybody there were men. Yeah. Oh, I took that about like 3 months ago. The building is still there, yeah. It's on Blaine Avenue on the east side. And it's a really, you can kind of tell it was an old police precinct, but it is a small building. So you think about 200 men jammed into that building, it's pretty extraordinary. Yes, sir. You know, from my reading on it, and his name is going to escape me, the guy who was the CEO of U.S. Steel was not a steel man, quote unquote. He hadn't come up in the steel industry, and he had a much more practical outlook, and his idea was U.S. Steel was profitable enough to recognize a union and secure labor peace. People like Girdler had come up in the steel industry, and they were just much more vehemently anti-union. Their idea was they had management's rights, and the workers didn't get a say in what they did. And they just refused, especially Republic Steel, just refused to negotiate or to do anything with it. They were adamantly anti-union until the very end, as I mentioned, when the government basically just put the boots to them and said, you're going to have to go along with this if you're going to want to get any of the war contracts, and of course they all wanted that. So, but yeah, the efforts to unionize the steel industry went on for decades, and it really wasn't until the 1940s that they finally were successful in unionizing the steel industry. But that effort went way back into, the 19th century with like strikes at Carnegie Steel, especially the Homestead strike, if any of you are familiar with that, in 1892, one of the most bloody strikes of the time with Andrew Carnegie and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel and Tin Workers, as it was known way back then. Somebody else have their hand up over here? Oh, yes, sir.
When did the mob start coming in?
Well, the mob or organized crime is here during this time period. It's here in the 20s too, especially because of bootlegging. Bootlegging during Prohibition was what built the modern mafia. And when Prohibition ended, they had made a ton of money. That's when you saw, the birth of the 5 families in New York City and the commission and all that stuff. But the mob here, after Prohibition, they just go back into gambling. And gambling is used, yes, the mob is here through the 20s and 30s. It looks a little bit different than it would in decades before. There were a lot of ethnic groups involved in bootlegging and gambling. The Greeks, the Croatians, not just the Italians, but of course the Italians ended up being the most well organized.
Yeah.
The Irish. Sorry, I didn't throw the Irish in there.
WPA.
Yes.
Given work based on a skill you had, or just a warm body that showed up?
It was really for anybody. Of course, some guys did have skills. Some were quote-unquote unskilled workers. Probably depended on the project because they did so many different things. Everything from building bridges to, putting additions onto schools. But they probably had a lot of skilled labor to pick from because so many guys were just out of work. But yeah, I think it was really for anybody. I think if you were an able-bodied guy who would go out and work, then you could get a job at the WPA.
Yeah. Wasn't the fairground
At the Canfield Fairgrounds, the grandstand, that was a WPA project. There's a lot of them in this. You can still see a lot of them here. Even sometimes when you drive past old buildings that have been torn down, there's like a WPA marker in the ground that'll remind you that there used to be a school there or whatever that they built. Yes, sir.
Other projects also for like authors and musicians, because
Yes.
you had to write a book about Mill Creek Park is a WPA project. I thought.
Yeah, I mentioned in my other book, if you go to the post office in downtown Warren, or the post office in Struthers, or the post office in Camel, the post office in Hubbard, there's a lot of it wasn't officially part of the WPA, but sometimes it was a government project that put mural artists to work painting murals, usually in post offices across the country. If you go online and Google it, there's a whole database of all the post office murals in the United States that were produced, in the thousands. So yeah, they also, they hired people to write plays. At Mill Creek Park, they had out-of-work musicians that taught people how to play the violin. Yeah, it was not just blue-collar workers. They also hired out-of-work journalists and writers to go across the country and do the oral histories of the last surviving African Americans who remembered being enslaved. And that became a whole project that you can access online, just oral, and that took place in this area too. Interviews with people, the last people who remembered being enslaved and then liberated during the Civil War. And that's another fascinating aspect of history that came out of the WPA. So yeah, it was a big thing. It wasn't just paving roads and things like that.
Do you ever think about the KKK? I know they came to Niles during the Depression. Did they come through Youngstown at the same time?
The KKK was big in the 20s. In fact, they had political power here in Youngstown. But right before, not too long before the Depression, the Klan fell apart. Mostly because there was a lot of internal corruption, and some of the high-ranking Klan officials were convicted of some pretty heinous crimes. And by the Depression, the organization had pretty much fallen apart already. It still existed, but as time would go by, it would pretty much disappear in the area. And I think the Depression really broke the back of it because, I wouldn't want to take this too far, but there was a bit of an equality and misery for people during the Depression. So there was a much more sense of a communal struggle, and that's, I think, maybe why the labor movement came more into the fore, because so many people were immiserated. It was like the equality of misery in some sense, I guess you could say. I wouldn't want to push that too far, but there was some of that. Anybody else? All right. Thanks. Oh, sorry.
So with unemployment being so high, how did they get the Social Security tax passed? Like, how did they even come up with that idea?
You know, I don't know where they I can't remember where they came up with the idea of Social Security. By the time the Social Security Act goes through in 35, unemployment is much way down from the height.
So in 19...
It maybe been at like 12 or 13 or 14%. I mean, still high by that time, but it was, the Depression had eased a lot by 1935 when that was passed.
Why was it just the tax part, not the act, but the tax you said passing?
Oh, well, yeah, that was all part of the Social Security Act, the mechanism for funding Social Security. So now, yeah, I mean, you know how Social Security works now. That was a completely new thing, because of course before that there was no Social Security or anything like that. It was just either you died or, you know, there were people, of course, that ended up out at the quote-unquote poorhouse out in Canfield, out there on Herbert Road. That was a pre-Social Security thing where a lot of people that survived until old age and didn't have money, you know, ended up in some kind of facility like that. So, yeah, but yeah, that was one aspect of why the economy had some problems a little bit later in the 30s.
Wasn't the original thing about Social Security having to do with the Women's and Children's Act? A lot of it had to do with trying to, you know.
You know, I do not.
How that worked, and they were, and that might have been why it was able to be passed, because it was, you know, women and children originally.
Well, you know, the Supreme Court was, for a while, was striking down almost every aspect of New Deal legislation. And Roosevelt threatened to pack the court. And I think because of that, and because of all of the big labor disturbances in the country, and I think the fear, too, that, you know, you had the Soviet Union and communism out there. And I think Roosevelt, in his own way, I think was trying to tell the powers that be that, you know, we can have the New Deal, or we can have the Bolshevik Revolution, or we can have Adolf Hitler, or something like that. And the court later backs off and starts letting things like the Wagner Act go through, and there's a grudging acceptance of the New Deal that goes on for a long time. You know, even in the 50s, you had Eisenhower, who's a big Republican, who was very comfortable with the New Deal and things like Social Security. But, you know, Eisenhower had been through the Depression too, and World War II, so he learned some lessons from history, probably. All right, thank you. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Sean. Very informative and a great segue into next month, which will be Thursday, April 17th, right here, and we will look at that tremendous decade of change and upheaval and carnage and the post-war era of the 1940s. Thank you for coming out again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here, and hope to see you again next month.